The king of country discovers his wife's silent tears after 50 years, and what happens next will touch your heart. The Texas sun was beginning its slow descent behind the rolling hills when George Strait's black pickup truck turned into the familiar gravel driveway of his San Antonio ranch. The dust kicked up by his tires created a golden cloud in the evening light, and for the first time in 3 weeks, George felt his shoulders truly relax. The promotional tour for his latest album had been a whirlwind of interviews, photo shoots, and appearances that had taken him from Nashville to Los Angeles and back again. But now, finally, he was home. At 69 years old, George had learned to treasure these quiet moments between the storms of his public life. The ranch stretched out before him like a piece of heaven carved from the Texas landscape. White fences marking the boundaries of pastures where his horses grazed peacefully. The sprawling main house with its wraparound porch, where he and Norma had shared countless sunsets over the past 5 decades. This was his sanctuary, his reminder of who he was before the world knew his name. As he parked the truck near the back entrance, George noticed something that made his heart skip. Norma's car was in the driveway, but the house seemed unusually quiet. No lights flickered in the kitchen windows where she usually prepared their evening meal, no sound of the television drifting from the living room. After 52 years of marriage, George knew his wife's rhythms as well as his own heartbeat, and something felt different. He grabbed his worn leather duffel bag from the passenger seat and stepped out into the warm evening air. The familiar scents of hay and wildflowers filled his lungs, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the gentle lowing of cattle. This was the life he had built with Norma, brick by brick, song by song, year by year. Fame had brought them many things, but it had never changed the fundamental truth of what mattered most: family, love, and the simple pleasures of home. If you're watching this story unfold and feeling moved by George and Norma's enduring love, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us about your own lasting relationships. Share where you're watching from around the world, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Your engagement means everything to us, and we're so grateful you've chosen to spend this time with us. George walked quietly toward the back door, planning to surprise Norma with his early arrival. He had told her he wouldn't be home until late, wanting to see the joy light up her face when he appeared unexpectedly. But as he rounded the corner of the house, heading toward the kitchen entrance, he spotted her through the screen door that led to the back porch. Norma was sitting in her favorite wicker chair, the one they had bought together at a flea market in Fredericksburg 20 years ago. Her silver hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and she wore the soft blue sweater he had given her last Christmas. But what stopped George in his tracks, what made his breath catch in his throat, was the sight of tears streaming silently down her cheeks. In all their years together, through the devastating loss of their daughter Jennifer in that car accident back in 1986, through the pressures of his career and the challenges that came with living in the public eye, George had seen Norma cry perhaps a dozen times. She was the strongest woman he knew, the anchor that had kept their family grounded when the winds of fame and tragedy threatened to tear them apart. To see her sitting alone, lost in what appeared to be profound sadness, sent a wave of concern through him that was almost physical in its intensity. George set down his bag carefully, not wanting to make any noise that might disturb whatever private moment she was having. From where he stood, partially hidden by the kitchen doorframe, he could see that she was holding something small in her hands. Her fingers moved over the object with a tenderness that spoke of deep significance, and every few seconds she would lift it closer to her face as if trying to see some detail more clearly in the fading light. The sight of his wife in distress awakened something primal in George, the same protective instinct that had driven him to work 3 jobs in the early days of their marriage to make sure she never wanted for anything. The same fierce love that had made him turn down countless opportunities that would have taken him away from home for extended periods. Success meant nothing if it came at the expense of the woman who had believed in him when he was just a shy kid from Poteet with a guitar and a dream. He watched as Norma wiped her eyes with the back of her free hand, still cradling whatever she held against her chest. The gesture was so vulnerable, so achingly familiar, that George felt his own eyes begin to sting. How many times had he seen her make that same motion over the years? When their son Bubba had his first heartbreak, when George's father passed away, when the doctor had delivered the news about Jennifer that had changed their lives forever. But this seemed different somehow. There was something in her posture, in the way she held her head, that suggested these weren't tears of grief or worry. They seemed almost nostalgic, as if she were crying over something beautiful that had been lost to time, something precious that existed now only in memory. George knew he should announce his presence, should go to her and offer whatever comfort she needed. But something held him back, some instinct that told him this was a moment that needed to unfold naturally. He had learned over the decades that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was simply witness someone else's pain without immediately trying to fix it. So he waited, his heart aching with love and concern, as his wife of more than 5 decades sat in the gathering dusk, lost in thoughts he could only imagine. The evening air was growing cooler, and he could see goosebumps rising on her bare arms. But still she sat there, absorbed in whatever memory or emotion had taken hold of her. Finally, unable to bear seeing her distress any longer, George stepped forward. The floorboards of the porch creaked under his weight, and Norma's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. For just a moment, he caught a glimpse of something that looked almost like guilt crossing her features, as if she had been caught doing something she shouldn't. "Norma?" George's voice was soft, filled with all the love and concern he felt. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" She quickly tried to compose herself, wiping at her cheeks and attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. But it was too late. George had seen her tears, had witnessed her private moment of vulnerability, and nothing she could say now would erase his concern. "George!" she exclaimed, her voice slightly higher than usual. "I thought you weren't coming home until late. You startled me." He moved closer, his weathered hands reaching out to touch her shoulders. "I finished early and wanted to surprise you, but it looks like I'm the one who got surprised. What's got you so upset, honey?" Norma looked down at her hands, and for the first time, George could see clearly what she had been holding. It was a small wooden box, the kind you might find at a craft fair or antique store. The wood was dark with age, and the brass hinges had developed a green patina that spoke of decades of existence. He didn't recognize it immediately, but something about it tugged at his memory, like a song heard from a great distance. "I was cleaning out the attic while you were gone," Norma said quietly, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze that rustled through the oak trees surrounding their home. "You know how I've been meaning to organize all those old boxes up there. Well, I found this tucked away in a corner, in a cardboard box that was so old it was practically falling apart." She opened the wooden box with careful reverence, and George felt his breath catch in his throat. Inside, nestled in what had once been white satin but had now yellowed with age, were 2 items that transported him instantly back through the decades, to a time when his hair was dark brown instead of silver, when his hands were smooth instead of calloused from years of guitar playing, when the biggest stage he had ever dreamed of playing was the honky-tonk down the road from their high school. The first item was a pair of concert tickets, so old and fragile that they looked like they might crumble at the slightest touch, but George could still make out the faded print. Gruene Hall, New Braunfels, Texas. Saturday night dance. Admission, $2. The date was barely legible, but he didn't need to see it to know exactly when those tickets were from. It was their first official date, back when they were both 18 years old, and he was still trying to work up the courage to hold her hand. But it was the second item that truly stopped his heart. A cassette tape, the clear plastic case cracked with age, the handwritten label so faded he could barely make out his own youthful handwriting. "For Norma, with all my love, George." George stared at the cassette tape, as if he were looking at a ghost from his past. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached out to touch the fragile plastic case, remembering with crystal clarity the night he had made that recording. It was the summer of 1972, just a few months after their graduation from Pearsall High School. He had borrowed his friend Tommy's cheap cassette recorder and spent an entire evening in his childhood bedroom, playing the same song over and over until he felt he had captured it perfectly. "I can't believe you still have this," George whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The tape represented so much more than just a recording. It was proof of the dreams they had shared, the promises they had made to each other when the future stretched out before them like an endless highway full of possibilities. Norma's tears began flowing again, but this time George could see they were mixed with something else, a bittersweet joy that came from rediscovering a piece of their shared history that had been thought lost forever. "I had completely forgotten about it," she said softly. "When I saw it there in that old box surrounded by dust and cobwebs, it all came flooding back. Do you remember that night, George? Do you remember what you told me when you gave this to me?" How could he possibly forget? That night had been a turning point in their relationship, the moment when George had finally found the courage to tell Norma not just that he loved her, but that he wanted to spend the rest of his life making music and building a future together. The song on that tape was the first one he had ever written completely by himself, inspired by the way she looked when she laughed, the way her eyes sparkled when she was excited about something, the way she made him feel like he could conquer the world just by believing in him. "I told you that someday I was going to be a real songwriter," George said, settling into the wicker chair beside her, "and that when I made it big, that song would be my first single. I was so sure of myself back then, wasn't I?" "You were," Norma smiled through her tears. "You were so determined, so passionate about your music. Sometimes I wonder what happened to that young man who was going to take Nashville by storm with his acoustic guitar and his homemade recordings." The comment hit George harder than he expected. Not because it was cruel, Norma would never intentionally hurt him, but because it contained a grain of truth that he had been avoiding for years. Somewhere along the way, in the pursuit of commercial success and industry approval, he had lost touch with that young songwriter, who poured his heart into every lyric, who wrote songs not because market research suggested they would be hits, but because he had something genuine to say. "I'm still here," George said quietly, reaching over to take Norma's free hand in his. "That young man is still here, Norma. He's just been buried under a lot of other things. Record label meetings, radio promotions, award shows. Sometimes I feel like I spend so much time being George Strait, the country music star, that I forget how to be just George, the guy who fell in love with you at a school dance." Norma squeezed his hand, and he could feel all the years of their marriage in that simple gesture, the struggles they had overcome, the joys they had shared, the unshakable bond that had kept them together when so many other couples in the entertainment industry had fallen apart. "I know you're still there," she said. "I see glimpses of him sometimes, when you're playing guitar on the porch in the evenings, or when you're teaching the grandkids old songs. But it's been so long since I've seen him fully, you know. Really seen him." The weight of her words settled over George like a heavy blanket. He thought about the past few years, the constant touring, the pressure to maintain his position at the top of the country music charts, the business decisions and career moves that had consumed so much of his time and energy. When was the last time he had written a song just for the joy of creating something beautiful? When was the last time he had played music simply because it made him happy, not because there was a contract to fulfill or an audience to please? "Play it," Norma said suddenly, holding out the cassette tape. "I want to hear it again. I want to remember what it felt like to be 18 years old and completely in love with a boy who wrote songs just for me." George looked at the tape, then at his wife's hopeful face, and felt something crack open inside his chest. "Honey, I don't think we even have a cassette player anymore. It's been years since—" "There's one in the guest bedroom," Norma interrupted. "That old boombox from the 80s that Jennifer used to play her music on. I saw it just last week when I was dusting." The mention of their daughter's name hung in the air between them, as it always did. Even after all these years, Jennifer's presence was still felt in every corner of their home, in every family gathering, in every moment of joy that was tinged with the sadness of her absence. George knew that Norma was thinking the same thing he was, that Jennifer would have loved this moment, would have teased them about being sentimental old romantics, while secretly treasuring the proof of her parents' enduring love. "All right," George said, standing up from his chair. "Let's go find that boombox. But I'm warning you, my voice was even more terrible back then than it is now." Norma laughed, the sound like music in the gathering darkness. "Your voice was perfect then, and it's perfect now. You just can't see it because you're too busy trying to sound like everyone else expects you to sound." They made their way inside the house, George's arm around Norma's shoulders, both of them carrying the weight of memory and possibility. The guest bedroom was at the end of the hall, the room that had once been Jennifer's before she moved out to start her own life. Norma had redecorated it years ago, but George still felt a pang every time he entered, still expected to see his daughter's riding trophies on the dresser and her high school graduation photo on the nightstand. The boombox sat on a shelf in the closet, dusty but intact. George plugged it in and was relieved when the power light flickered on. He took the cassette from Norma with hands that were steadier than he felt and slipped it into the player. For a moment they both stared at the machine as if it might explode. Then George pressed play. The sound quality was terrible, just as he had expected. There was a constant hiss of background noise, and his young voice wavered with nervousness. But as the familiar melody filled the small room, George felt something shift inside him. He remembered sitting on his twin bed in his parents' house, his old acoustic guitar across his lap, trying to find the perfect words to express how Norma made him feel. The song was simple, just 3 chords and a basic verse-chorus structure that any beginning guitarist could master. But the lyrics, the lyrics came straight from the heart of an 18-year-old boy who had never felt anything as powerful as first love. He sang about the way Norma's smile could brighten the darkest day, about how her laughter sounded like church bells on Sunday morning, about his dreams of taking her dancing in cities they had never seen and showing her the world beyond the small Texas town where they had grown up. As the song played, George watched Norma's face in the dim light of the bedroom. Her eyes were closed, and she was swaying slightly to the music, transported back to that long-ago summer when everything had seemed possible. When the recording ended with his young voice saying, "I love you, Norma Jean, and I always will," she opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression of such tenderness that it took his breath away. "That boy," she said softly, "that boy who wrote this song, he promised me that no matter how famous he became, he would never forget who he was or where he came from. He promised me that success would never change the man I fell in love with." George felt his throat tighten with emotion. He wanted to tell her that he had kept that promise, that he was still the same person at heart. But looking at himself honestly, he wasn't sure that was entirely true. Success had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. The innocence and optimism of that young songwriter had been tempered by decades of industry politics, compromised by the necessity of making commercial decisions that sometimes went against his artistic instincts. "I don't know if I've kept that promise as well as I should have," George admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if that boy would recognize the man I've become." Norma reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her touch as gentle as it had been on their wedding day 52 years ago. "He's still there, George. I can see him right now, in the way you're looking at me. He's still there, and I still love him just as much as I did when we were 18. Something inside George broke open at her words, and before he could stop himself he was crying. Not the controlled, dignified tears of a man who had learned to manage his emotions in public, but the raw, overwhelming sobs of someone who had been carrying a burden he didn't even know he had been carrying. All these years, he had been chasing something he thought he needed: more success, more recognition, more proof that he had made the right choices in life. But sitting here in this quiet room, listening to an old cassette tape and looking into the eyes of the woman who had loved him before he was anybody special, George realized that everything he had ever truly wanted was right here. It had always been right here. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow, and suddenly he knew exactly what he had to do. George wiped his eyes and looked at Norma with a determination she hadn't seen in years. Without saying a word, he gently took the cassette from her hands and walked to the window, staring out at the vast expanse of their ranch. The moon had risen while they were inside, casting everything in a silvery glow that made the familiar landscape look almost magical. "I need to do something," George said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of decision that made Norma sit up straighter. "I need to make this right." "Make what right?" Norma asked, though something in her husband's tone told her that whatever he was planning would change everything about this evening. George turned back to her, and in his eyes she saw a spark she hadn't witnessed in years, the same fire that had burned in the young man who used to drive 2 hours just to play a 20-minute set at some dive bar, who believed so completely in his music that rejection only made him more determined. "I let that boy down, Norma. I let us down. Somewhere along the way I stopped writing songs from the heart and started writing them from some marketing playbook. I stopped being the man who would record a love song on a cheap cassette player just to see you smile." He began pacing the small room, his mind racing with possibilities. "Remember what you said about that promise I made, about never forgetting who I was? Well, I think I did forget, at least partially, but hearing that song tonight, seeing how it affected you, I remember now. I remember what it felt like to create something pure, something that came from a real place instead of from some industry executive's idea of what would sell records." Norma watched her husband with growing curiosity and excitement. She had seen George passionate about his music before, of course, but this felt different. This felt personal in a way that his professional enthusiasm never quite captured. "What are you thinking, George?" "I'm thinking," George said, stopping his pacing to kneel beside her chair, "that it's time I wrote you another song, A real song like the old days. Not something for the radio or the record label, but something just for you. Something that says everything I should have been saying all these years but got too caught up in the business to remember. The idea took root in his mind with startling clarity. He could already hear fragments of melody, could feel words forming on his tongue that had nothing to do with market demographics or radio playlists, and everything to do with the woman sitting before him, the woman who had stood by him through every triumph and tragedy of their long life together. "But George," Norma said gently, "you don't have to prove anything to me. I know you love me. I've never doubted that." "It's not about proving anything," George replied, taking her hands in his. "It's about remembering. It's about honoring that young couple who made promises to each other in cassette recordings and ticket stubs from honky-tonk dances. When was the last time I wrote you a song, Norma? Really wrote you a song, not just dedicated one of my hits to you from the stage?" Norma thought about it and realized with a start that she couldn't remember. There had been dedications, certainly, and George often said in interviews that his love songs were inspired by their relationship. But an actual song, written specifically for her, created in the intimate space of their private life rather than the public sphere of his career. It had been decades. George saw the realization cross her face and felt both sadness and excitement. Sadness for the lost opportunities, the romantic gestures that had been pushed aside by tour schedules and recording deadlines, but excitement too, because it wasn't too late. They were both still here, still in love, still capable of creating new memories to treasure alongside the old ones. "I want to do more than just write you a song," George continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I want to recreate that night. Not exactly, we're not 18 anymore, and I don't think my back could handle dancing until dawn at Green Hall. But the spirit of it, the feeling of it. I want to remind both of us what it felt like when music was about love instead of business, when the only audience that mattered was you." He stood up suddenly, energized by the developing plan. "Stay right here," he told Norma. "Don't move. I'll be right back." Before she could ask what he was doing, George was striding out of the room with more purpose in his step than she had seen in months. She heard his footsteps in the hallway, then the sound of him rummaging around in his music room, the converted spare bedroom where he kept his collection of guitars and the small recording setup he used when inspiration struck at home. While she waited, Norma looked around Jennifer's old room and felt her daughter's presence as strongly as if she were sitting right there with them. Jennifer had always been the one to push her parents to be more romantic with each other, to not let the demands of George's career overshadow the love that had brought them together in the first place. "You two are disgustingly cute," she used to say, "but you need to remember to be cute more often." George returned carrying his oldest acoustic guitar, not the vintage Martin he used for recording sessions or the custom-made instruments he played in concert, but the same beat-up Yamaha he had owned in high school. The finish was worn smooth in places from decades of use, and there was a small crack near the sound hole that he had never bothered to repair because he said it gave the guitar character. "For this old thing still sounds good," George said, settling back into his chair and testing the tuning. "It's the one I used to play for you when we were dating, before I could afford anything better." He began finger-picking a gentle melody, something wistful and familiar that seemed to capture the bittersweet nature of the evening. Norma recognized it as the opening to the song on the cassette tape, but played with the skill and confidence that came from 50 years of professional musicianship. "I've been thinking about this all wrong," George said as he played. "I've been treating my music like it's separate from my life, like there's George Strait the entertainer and George the husband, and never the two shall meet. But that's not how it started. It started with me wanting to express how I felt about you, and somehow along the way I forgot that the best songs always come from the most honest places." As he continued to play, words began to form, not forced or calculated, but flowing naturally like water finding its way downhill. He started to sing, softly at first, then with growing confidence. 50 years have passed us by since that first dance floor, but when I look into your eyes, I see that girl I fell for. The music's changed, the stages grew, the lights got bright and blinding, but in this quiet moment here, it's you that I keep finding." Norma felt tears welling up again, but these were different from the nostalgic tears she had shed earlier. These were tears of recognition, of feeling truly seen and appreciated by the man she loved. This wasn't George Strait, the country music superstar, performing for her. This was George, her George, speaking directly to her heart the way he used to do when they were young, and the world was full of possibilities. He continued to sing, the lyrics coming to him as naturally as breathing, each verse building on the last to create a complete picture of their life together. He sang about the early days when they had nothing but love and dreams, about the challenges they had faced and overcome, about the way she had stood by him when the music industry had tried to change who he was, and about his gratitude for the life they had built together. When he finished, the room was filled with a silence that felt sacred. George set the guitar aside and looked at his wife, suddenly uncertain. "What do you think?" he asked. Does it sound like something that boy on the cassette tape might have written?" Norma couldn't speak at first. She was overwhelmed by the realization that the man she had married, the real man beneath all the fame and success, was still there, still capable of surprising her, still able to make her feel like the most important person in the world. Finally, she found her voice. "It sounds," she said slowly, "like the most beautiful song I've ever heard, but more than that, it sounds like you, the real you, the you I fell in love with all those years ago." George felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For the first time in years, he felt like he had created something that mattered, something that came from an authentic place, rather than from commercial considerations or industry expectations. But more importantly, he had reconnected with the part of himself that Norma had fallen in love with, the part that had somehow gotten buried under decades of professional success. "I want to record it properly," George said suddenly. "Not here on some home setup, but in a real studio. I want to arrange it with strings and maybe some steel guitar, make it something beautiful that we can keep forever. And then—" He paused, an idea forming that was so perfect, so right, that he wondered why it hadn't occurred to him immediately. "And then?" Norma prompted, seeing the excitement building in her husband's eyes. George smiled, and for a moment Norma could see the 18-year-old boy she had fallen in love with, still alive and present in the 70-year-old man before her. "And then I want to call the kids and tell them we're having a party." The next morning brought a flurry of activity that the Straight Ranch hadn't seen in years. George had barely slept, his mind buzzing with plans and possibilities, and by sunrise he was already making phone calls. The first was to his son, George Jr., known to everyone as Bubba, who lived just 20 minutes away with his wife Tamara and their children. "Dad," Bubba's voice was thick with sleep when he answered the phone. "It's 6 in the morning. Is everything okay?" "Everything's perfect, son," George replied, unable to keep the excitement out of his voice. "I need you and Tamara and the kids to come over for dinner tonight, and don't make any plans for this weekend. We're going to have a celebration." Bubba sat up in bed, fully awake now. His father didn't usually call this early unless something significant was happening, and there was something in George's tone that he hadn't heard in years, a lightness, an energy that reminded him of childhood memories of his dad coming home from the studio, buzzing with creative excitement about a new song or album. "What kind of celebration?" Bubba asked, motioning for Tamara to wake up beside him. "The kind that's long overdue," George said cryptically. "Just trust me on this one and call your cousins too. I want all the grandkids here. This is going to be something special." After hanging up with Bubba, George made similar calls to his brother Buddy's children and his sister Pensie's family. Each conversation was brief, but carried the same message. Something important was happening at the ranch, and their presence was requested for what George described only as a family celebration that's been 52 years in the making. While George worked the phone, Norma moved through the house with an energy she hadn't felt in months. She had awakened to find her husband already up and dressed, humming the melody from the song he had created for her the night before. The sight of him standing at the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the sunrise paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and pink, had filled her with a contentment that went bone deep. "What can I do to help?" she asked, as George finished his last phone call. "Just be yourself," George said, pulling her into his arms. "Be the woman who saved that cassette tape all these years, who reminded me of who I used to be. That's all I need from you." But George had much more planned than a simple family dinner. After Norma left to run errands in town, he made another series of phone calls, these to professional contacts he hadn't spoken to in months. First was his longtime sound engineer, Mike, who had worked on dozens of George's albums and understood better than anyone how to capture the intimate, personal quality George was looking for. "I need to book studio time," George told him. "Just a few hours, nothing fancy. I want to record something special." "Sure, George," Mike replied. What's the timeline? Are we talking about a new album project? We're talking about a love song for my wife, George said simply. And we're talking about tomorrow morning, if the studio's available. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mike had worked with George long enough to know that when the king of country made up his mind about something, especially something personal, there was no point in arguing or asking too many questions. I'll make some calls, Mike said. We'll make it happen. Next, George contacted 3 of his favorite session musicians, players he had worked with for years who understood not just his musical style, but his artistic sensibilities. He explained what he was planning in broad strokes, emphasizing that this wasn't a commercial project, but something deeply personal that required their most sensitive and heartfelt playing. By noon, George had reserved studio time, assembled a small band, and even arranged for a string quartet to add the elegant touches he envisioned for Norma's song. But the most important call came last, to his booking agent and longtime friend, Tom. "Tom, I need you to do something for me that's going to sound a little crazy," George said. "With you, George, crazy usually means interesting," Tom replied. "What do you need?" "I want to book Gruene Hall for a private event this Saturday night, just for family. I want to recreate something that happened there a very long time ago, and I want it to be perfect." Gruene Hall, the oldest continuously operating dance hall in Texas, held a special place in George and Norma's history. It was where they had attended their first official date, where George had first worked up the courage to ask Norma to dance, where he had realized that what he felt for her was going to last a lifetime. The thought of bringing their family there, of sharing that sacred space with the people they loved most, felt like the perfect way to honor both their past and their future. "Consider it done," Tom said without hesitation. "How many people are we talking about?" "Maybe 30, including kids," George said. "Just immediate family and a few close friends. I want to hire a small band too. Nothing fancy, just good musicians who can play the old songs, the ones people actually danced to back in our day." As George made his arrangements, word began to spread through the extended Strait family that something significant was happening. Bubba called his cousins, who called their parents, who called their siblings, and by mid-afternoon the family phone network was buzzing with speculation about what George might be planning. The first family members began arriving at the ranch around 4 o'clock. Bubba and Tamara came with their teenage children, Harvey and George III, both of whom had inherited their grandfather's musical abilities and often played with him during family gatherings. They were followed shortly by George's brother Buddy and his wife, then by various nieces, nephews, and grandchildren, each carrying covered dishes and bottles of wine, turning the impromptu gathering into the kind of potluck celebration that the Strait family had perfected over decades of holidays and special occasions. As the house filled with the laughter and chatter of 3 generations, George felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the Texas heat. This was what mattered, not the sold-out arenas or the platinum albums, but the sound of his grandson's laughter mixing with his brother's voice, the sight of his daughter-in-law helping Norma in the kitchen, the easy camaraderie of a family that genuinely enjoyed being together. When everyone had gathered in the living room after dinner, George stood up and asked for attention. The room gradually quieted, children settling into their parents' laps, adults turning expectant faces toward the family patriarch. "I want to thank you all for coming on such short notice," George began, his voice carrying the same natural authority it held on stage, but tempered with an intimacy that was reserved for moments like these. "Norma and I have something we want to share with you, something that reminded us both of how blessed we are to have this family, this life we've built together." He gestured for Norma to join him, and she rose from her seat with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. They had talked through what George wanted to say, but she still wasn't entirely sure what he had planned beyond the basic outline he had shared with her. "Last night," George continued, "your grandmother found something that took us both back to the very beginning of our story, something that reminded me of promises I made a long time ago, and of the kind of man I wanted to be for her and for all of you." He nodded to Bubba, who had been secretly briefed on his role in the evening's proceedings. Bubba disappeared into the kitchen and returned with the old boombox from Jennifer's room, along with the cassette tape that had started everything. "This," George said, holding up the tape, "is a recording I made for your grandmother when we were 18 years old. It was the first song I ever wrote, and it was written for one person, the woman standing beside me, who has been my inspiration for everything good I've ever accomplished." A murmur of interest went through the room. Even the teenagers put down their phones, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. George's grandchildren had heard plenty of their grandfather's music over the years, but the idea of hearing something he had created as a teenager, something deeply personal and previously unknown to them, captured their attention completely. "We're going to play it for you," George said, "not because it's good. The sound quality is terrible and my voice was even worse than it is now, but because it represents something important. It represents the foundation that everything else in our lives has been built on." As Bubba set up the boombox, George looked around the room at the faces of the people he loved most in the world. His brother Buddy, who had been there for every major moment of his life. His daughter-in-law Tamara, who had brought such joy to their son and given them beautiful grandchildren. The grandchildren themselves ranging in age from 8 to 25, each carrying forward pieces of the family legacy in their own unique ways. But most of all, he looked at Norma, who stood beside him with tears already forming in her eyes. She knew what was coming, not just the playing of the old tape, but everything that would follow. George had shared his plans with her that morning, and she had been overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness and romanticism of what he was proposing. The tape began to play, and the room filled with the scratchy, imperfect sound of young George Strait, singing a love song that no one beyond Norma had ever heard. The lyrics were simple, the melody basic, but the emotion was unmistakable. This wasn't the polished country superstar that the world knew. This was a teenager in love, pouring his heart into a cheap recording in hopes of making the girl he adored understand how much she meant to him. As the song played, George watched his family's faces, seeing recognition dawn in some and surprise in others. The children were fascinated by this glimpse into their grandparents' youth, while the adults seemed moved by the raw sincerity of the recording. When the tape ended, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Harvey, George's teenage grandson, spoke up. "Granddad, that was really beautiful. I mean really beautiful. It doesn't sound like your usual stuff at all." George smiled. "That's exactly the point, Harvey. It doesn't sound like my stuff because it wasn't meant to be stuff. It was meant to be love, pure and simple." He took a deep breath, knowing that what came next would surprise everyone, including Norma, because he hadn't told her about this particular part of his plan. "Which brings me to why I asked you all here tonight," George continued. "Tomorrow, I'm going to record a new version of that song, arranged properly with real musicians and modern equipment. And this Saturday night, we're all going to Gruene Hall, the same place where your grandmother and I had our first date, for a very special celebration." The silence that followed George's announcement was broken by his 8-year-old granddaughter, Emma, who clapped her hands together with pure delight. "Are you and Grandma getting married again?" she asked, her voice filled with the kind of innocent excitement that only children can muster. George chuckled and knelt down to Emma's level. "In a way, sweetheart, we're going to renew our wedding vows. We're going to promise each other all over again that we'll love each other forever, just like we did 52 years ago." The room erupted in excited chatter as the implications of George's announcement sank in. Bubba immediately began calculating logistics in his head: catering, decorations, photography. Tamara was already thinking about what everyone would wear. The teenage grandchildren were exchanging glances that seemed to say they had always known their grandparents were cooler than most people their age. But it was Buddy, George's brother, who asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "George, this is beautiful and all, but why now? What brought this on?" George stood up, his arm finding its way around Norma's waist as naturally as breathing. "Because sometimes it takes looking backward to remember how to move forward. Because your sister-in-law here reminded me last night of who I used to be, of promises I made that got buried under years of career pressures and public expectations, and because it's never too late to choose love over everything else." He paused, looking directly at Norma. "Your grandmother has stood by me through everything. The lean years when we didn't know if my music would ever amount to anything. The crazy years when success came so fast it nearly overwhelmed us, and the heartbreaking years after we lost Jennifer. She's been my anchor, my inspiration, and my best friend, but somewhere along the way I stopped showing her that in the ways that matter most." Norma wiped tears from her eyes, overwhelmed by the public declaration of love from a man who had always been somewhat private about his deepest emotions, even with family. "George, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "I do have to, because you deserve to hear it, and our family deserves to witness it. Tomorrow, I'm going to record that song I wrote for you last night. A new song that says everything I should have been saying all these years." And Saturday night, we're going to dance to it in the same place where we fell in love, surrounded by all the people who matter most to us." The next morning brought a different kind of energy to the ranch. While Norma spent the day coordinating with Tamara and the other women in the family about arrangements for Saturday's celebration, George drove to the recording studio with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Mike, his sound engineer, had assembled exactly the right team. The musicians, steel guitarist Lloyd Green, fiddle player Johnny Gimble, and pianist Hargus Pig Robbins, were legends in their own right. Men who had played on countless classic country recordings and understood instinctively how to support a song without overwhelming it. The string quartet, borrowed from the San Antonio Symphony, brought an elegance that elevated the simple melody George had written into something that sounded both timeless and contemporary. "Let's run through it once," George said as he settled behind the microphone, his old Yamaha guitar in his hands. "Remember, this isn't about perfection, it's about feeling." What happened next was one of those magical recording sessions that every musician dreams of but rarely experiences. The song seemed to arrange itself, each instrument finding its natural place in the musical landscape George had created. The steel guitar added gentle tears of emotion, the fiddle provided warmth and nostalgia, the piano offered a steady heartbeat beneath it all, and the strings soared during the chorus like the musical equivalent of a loving embrace. But it was George's vocal performance that truly transformed the song from a simple love ballad into something transcendent. Gone was any trace of the calculated professionalism that had marked his recent recordings. Instead, he sang with the vulnerability and honesty of a man who had rediscovered why he had started making music in the first place. Every word carried weight, every phrase breathed with genuine emotion. When they finished the final take, the studio was silent except for the gentle hum of electronic equipment. Mike, who had engineered hundreds of recording sessions over his career, wiped his eyes and shook his head in wonder. "George," he said quietly, "in 30 years of working with you, I've never heard you sing anything more beautiful than that. It's not just a song. It's a prayer, a promise, and a love letter all rolled into one." Meanwhile, at the ranch, Norma was experiencing her own kind of magic. Word of the vow renewal ceremony had spread through their circle of close friends, and the phone hadn't stopped ringing with offers of help. Their neighbor Maria insisted on providing flowers from her prize-winning garden. Their longtime friend Bob volunteered to photograph the ceremony. The pastor from their church called to ask if they needed someone to officiate, though George had already arranged for the same minister who had married them the first time, now retired but still sharp and delighted to be asked. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of perfect Texas weather that seemed designed specifically for outdoor celebrations. Gruene Hall, normally bustling with tourists and dance enthusiasts, had been transformed into an intimate venue that managed to feel both grand and personal. White lights had been strung between the rafters, Maria's flowers created stunning arrangements on every table, and a small stage had been set up for the band George had hired. Local musicians who specialized in the kind of classic country and swing music that had been popular during George and Norma's youth. As the sun began to set, family members started arriving in their finest clothes. The men wore suits and western boots, the women elegant dresses that ranged from vintage styles that echoed the 1970s to contemporary designs that still honored the country setting. The grandchildren, scrubbed and polished for the occasion, carried themselves with the special dignity that children reserve for truly important family events. George stood at one end of the hall, resplendent in a black suit, with subtle western details and his signature cowboy hat. But it was the expression on his face that truly caught everyone's attention, a mixture of nervousness and joy that made him look decades younger than his 69 years. When Norma appeared at the opposite end of the hall, the entire gathering fell silent. She had chosen a dress in soft ivory silk that complemented her silver hair and highlighted the timeless elegance that had first caught George's eye all those years ago. But more than her appearance, it was the radiant happiness on her face that took everyone's breath away. As she walked toward George, not down a formal aisle, but simply across the worn wooden floors where thousands of couples had danced over the decades, the small band began to play. Not the wedding march, but the gentle instrumental version of the song George had just recorded, the new arrangement of the melody that had started their love story. When Norma reached George, he took her hands and looked into her eyes with an intensity that made everyone else in the room disappear. The minister, a kind man in his 80s who had known them since they were newlyweds, spoke briefly about the rarity and beauty of a love that grows stronger with time rather than weaker. "George and Norma," he said, "you've already proven that your love can withstand anything life throws at you. Tonight isn't about making new promises. It's about celebrating the promises you've kept and reaffirming your commitment to keep them for whatever time you have left together." George's vows, when he spoke them, were simple but profound. He promised to never again let success or career pressures overshadow the love that had made everything else possible. He promised to remember daily that being Norma's husband was a greater honor than any award or recognition he had ever received. And he promised to keep writing her love songs, not for the world to hear, but for the two of them to treasure. Norma's response was equally heartfelt. She thanked George for reminding her that the young man she had fallen in love with was still there, still capable of surprising her, still able to make her feel like the most important person in the world. She promised to continue being his anchor and his inspiration, and to never let him forget the man he was before the world knew his name. When they exchanged new rings, simple gold bands that matched their original wedding rings, but were engraved with the date of this renewal ceremony, there wasn't a dry eye in the hall. But the most magical moment came when George nodded to the sound technician he had secretly arranged to be present. The opening notes of his newly recorded song filled the historic dance hall, and George led Norma onto the floor for their first dance as newlywed couple. As George's voice sang the words he had written specifically for this moment, specifically for her, Norma felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, dancing with exactly the right person, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The song told the story of their entire relationship, the young love that had started it all, the challenges they had faced together, the joys they had shared, and the gratitude George felt for every day he got to spend loving her. But more than that, it was a promise for the future, a commitment to treasure whatever time they had left and to never take their love for granted again. When the song ended, the rest of the family joined them on the dance floor, 3 generations swaying together to the music of their shared history. George looked around at the faces of the people he loved most, his son and daughter-in-law, his grandchildren, his brother and sister-in-law, the friends who had become family over the decades, and realized that this moment, this perfect convergence of past and present, was worth more than every award he had ever won, and every song that had ever climbed the charts. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and family members began to say their goodbyes, George and Norma stood together on the front porch of Gruene Hall, watching their loved ones drive away into the Texas night. "Thank you," Norma said quietly, leaning into George's embrace. "For what?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "For remembering," she replied. "For choosing us over everything else. For proving that the boy I fell in love with is still in there, still capable of the most romantic gestures." George kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling more content and complete than he had in years. "That boy never went anywhere," he said. "He was just waiting for the right moment to remind us both that love songs aren't worth anything unless they're sung to the person who inspired them." As they drove home through the quiet countryside, the cassette tape that had started everything safely tucked away in Norma's purse alongside the fresh recording of George's new song, both of them knew that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. They had rediscovered not just their love for each other, but the joy of creating something beautiful together, of prioritizing what truly mattered over what the world expected from them. The next morning would bring new possibilities. Maybe George would write another song. Maybe they would plan another adventure. Maybe they would simply spend the day on their porch, talking and laughing like the young couple they had been, and in all the ways that mattered, still were.